Chapter 8, History of Operating Systems. This week, we're going to look at operating systems as a whole. We're going to deep dive and look at how they've gotten to where they are. I mean, they weren't always all fancy and pretty like Windows 10 is. We're going to look at the whole world of Unix operating systems. For many of us, for many users, they've never even seen a Unix system before. So we're going to talk about that. And we're going to look at how Linux, which is now a very popular implementation of Unix, came about and how it evolved. We'll look at some of the various Linux distributions. We have a lab where we'll go in and see exactly how many there are out there. There's quite a few. We'll talk about open source versus closed source. How is it that I have to pay Microsoft $100 for a license to run Microsoft Office for a year versus going out and downloading OpenOffice for free? What's the difference? What's going on there? We'll look at that. And then we got to do a quick, actually kind of a fire hose, walk through history, going back and seeing how our current operating systems became what they are. We'll watch them develop over the last 30 years, really. It's all good stuff. And again, why are we doing this? Why do we care about history? Like it was in the hardware part, if you can't figure out where you're going, you don't know where you are. You absolutely need to understand how we got to where we are today. Look familiar? It's the same stuff we saw in hardware, only now we're focusing on the software, on the operating part, the part that us as administrators will probably spend most of our time in. So we see this thing out there, free software, open source. What is that? What is it really? Well, open source software has several definitions. That can mean a few things. In one case, it can be free, like it is totally free. You can do whatever you wish with it. But not all quote-unquote open source software is truly free, right? A lot of it is released under the GNU, or as I like to pronounce it, the GNU, a license. What is GNU? Well, GNU is a recursive acronym. It stands for GNU's Not Unix. And what this means is, that's actually got a lot of legalese behind it, but pretty much what it means is software released as GNU with a GNU license, you can give it away, you can sell it, you can modify it, you can do whatever you want to it, but you have to make the source code freely available. Let's contrast that to closed source software. We know this real well. Microsoft Windows, right? Or any of the Microsoft products. Most commercial software we buy is closed source. What that means is the source code is kept a secret. It's considered intellectual property of the vendor or the manufacturer. They go to great lengths actually to protect that source code. So, and I'm actually kind of a misnomer. We're not really purchasing the software. With this closed source stuff, we're purchasing a license to use the software. So I'm splitting hairs a little bit, but it is a key distinction. Keep in mind that Linux, by definition, is open source, which means its source code is freely available. Well, let's take a step back from Linux and look at where Unix came from, right? That's the source of all the many Linuxes that we see nowadays. Unix was born from the 1960s. It was a plan to make a multi-user operating system for actually really expensive computers. We're talking mainframes, mini computers, scientific workstations. This is high-end stuff. And really, customers at that time wanted an operating system that could support multiple users logged in either at the same time or over different times. So the original version of Unix was developed by AT&T Bell Labs, and this happened during the 1960s. The first version of it was released in 1970, and really, as far as Unix is concerned, January 1st, 1970 is the beginning of time. It's the start of the universe. All Unix machines, including Linux, set their system clocks by counting the number of seconds from January 1st, 1970. Right? There's the beginning of it. What's a proprietary Unix, you might ask? Really, we probably, unless you're working in IT, you probably won't see them. They're things like Sun Solaris, now owned by Oracle, HPUX, IBM AIX, very high-end operating systems for scientific graphics workstations. And that leads us to Linux, right? Where did Linux come from? Well, let's make a distinction first. Linux is not Unix, and we'll see why here in a second, although it is part of the Unix family. What? What are you talking about? What do you mean? Well, here's the deal. In the early 90s, there was a Finnish grad student by the name of Linus Torvalds. And he was a pretty smart guy, pretty big brain guy. And he was a computer science student over there in Finland. And he decided that he wanted to have a version of Unix he could run on his home PC. Well, at that time, there was no version of Unix. Like we said, Unix was for high-end, very expensive workstations. Well, Linus, being an enterprising and very smart guy, decided to go and write a version of Unix that runs on his PC. And being a little, not kind of modest, he named it after himself, hence Linux. So he didn't actually port over existing Unix. He copied it. He looked at it and recreated it using on the x86 PC architecture. So it is very Unix-like in structure. And he also released it as open source under the GNU license. So he wanted it to propagate. He wanted people to take it and work on it and make it something better. And over the last 25, 26 years, that's exactly what's happened. Nowadays, it sees a lot of use as the operating system for appliances. And I don't mean like refrigerators and toasters. I mean things like network load balancers, storage appliances, spam filters, that type of thing. If you go out and buy yourself a Barracuda spam filter, it's probably running Linux under the hood. It also sees a lot of use as a web server. Right? We have this thing called the LAMP stack, L-A-M-P, and that stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And it makes up like 80% of the web servers out there. We probably won't see this as an end user desktop, not commonly anyway, but you can certainly expect to see this in the server world as you move through your IT career. I said that people took Linux and ran with it, and boy did they ever. We actually have a lab on this, where you're going to go out to this website, distrowatch.com, and get a feel for how many are out there. Hundreds. Lots and lots and lots of Linux. Now, most of us are used to running Windows, Microsoft Windows. And when we think of Windows, we think of a GUI, a graphical user interface, where we got icons and windows we open up and drag around, and we got drag and drop and all that kind of stuff. Well, it didn't start that way. So we need to see how we got to where we are nowadays. I'm going to roll the clock back to 1981. And the year the IBM PC was introduced. For an operating system, it ran an operating system called DOS, Disk Operating System. And, well, you're looking at a picture of it right now. It wasn't the prettiest thing. It was a CLI environment, a command line interface, black screen, white letters, and everything you did, you had to type into it from the keyboard, which meant that you had to have a pretty extensive knowledge of the command syntax. You misspell something, it wasn't going to work. And I remember books on DOS, 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick, going through and talking about all the commands, and a lot of people had these on their desktop, right next to their PC, so they could reference what they were doing. Well, what about this GUI? How did that turn into what we know nowadays? If you've ever seen the movie Pirates of Silicon Valley, the story about the early years of Microsoft and Apple and all that, there was a scene in there where Steve Jobs and his crew from Apple in the early 80s made a trip out to Xerox PARC. PARC is the Palo Alto Research Center, a facility owned by Xerox. And there they saw the graphical user interface that was developed by the scientists there, stole it, and made this incredible product out of it we now know as the Macintosh. That's not completely true, but some of it is. The researchers at Xerox PARC indeed created a graphical user interface, and you're looking at it right here. This is actually from the 70s, right? This was never made available. This was never a commercial product, but this is what they came up with as a way of having users make systems easier for users to use. And really, if you look at this, it's very similar to what we have nowadays, right? We got buttons, we got little windows here, we have the ability to click on things. I would suggest that a modern user would be able to find their way around this environment fairly easily because it's so familiar to us. But like I said, this was a prototype. This wasn't actually released for commercial use. Now, if you believe the movie, the Pirates of Silicon Valley movie, along with some others, it kind of came in with the impression that Xerox never did anything with it, that they developed this fantastic technology and then gave it away and wasted it. Well, that's not true. They actually did attempt to develop a commercial product from it. You're looking at it right here, the Xerox 6085 workstation. It had a full graphical interface, and we look at it, very common to what we would see nowadays. Here's some kind of graphics program here with some guy's face. We got icons everywhere. We've got a little clock, systems here, or icons that represent the system and disk, and it looks like some kind of inbox over there. Problem is, this never really caught on. Commercially, it was a flop. Really, it was expensive and just didn't really work all that well. The concept wasn't fully cooked yet. Now, the people from Apple, they actually did go to the PARC facility and were inspired by the GUI they saw there. And they came back to Apple, but the first machine they produced to make use of a graphical user interface was not a Macintosh. It was this. It was a system called the Apple Lisa. Right? Lisa was actually named after Steve Jobs' daughter. It brought in a lot of groundbreaking elements of a GUI, stuff that we still use nowadays. There's a trash can, an icon for our disk drive, pull-down menus. This picture you're looking at right here is actually off an emulator from a website called the GUI Museum, which you'll be looking at in a lab today. Problem with the Lisa, it too was a commercial flop, right? It worked okay, but it was really expensive and didn't really get widespread adoption. It didn't really know what it was trying to be. Business didn't adopt it yet. And by this time, we're talking like 1983, the IBM PC was really making inroads into business. By 1984, Apple developed and released the Macintosh, including the Mac OS. And here's a picture of it right here. I believe this is actually like Mac OS, I think it's a picture of Mac OS 7, System 7, if I'm not mistaken. It brought in many of the elements that we know nowadays. Again, trash cans, icons, folders. This became synonymous with Apple. This became the Mac. And really, this environment didn't change a lot. I mean, it got fancier and prettier over the years, but it remained more or less the same up until around the year 2000, early 2000s, when Apple switched to OS X, or OS 10, which was the next generation beyond the original Macintosh OS. Well, where was Microsoft in this? If you were running an IBM PC with DOS on it, what choices did you have in 1984 and 1985 when Apple released the Mac with its pretty GUI? You had this. This was Microsoft's answer to the Mac, Windows 1.0, released in 1985. Wow, it's the only thing I can say about it. A lot of the stuff, the icons and the features that we now think of as being part of Windows, were actually under copyright protection from Apple, and they hadn't fought all their legal battles yet, so Microsoft couldn't copy a lot of it. So what we ended up with was an environment like this. Now, this is not an operating system. This is a program, it's a shell that runs on top of DOS. It's just a user environment. It was a way so you could click on stuff, but it didn't use icons. It used file names instead of icons for things. It represented the disk by these little symbols here. Primitive at best, right? This didn't really catch on. Commercially, this was a flop. Now, Microsoft didn't give up. In 1987, they released Windows 2.0. This is actually the first version of Windows I personally worked on. Same idea. It really wasn't changed that much from Windows 1.0. The resolution got higher because of EGA graphics. Still didn't have icons. Still just a shell that runs on top of DOS, and commercially not really that great of a success. By 1990, Microsoft was starting to get their act together a bit, and they released Windows 3.0. This is probably the first version of Windows that we could truly recognize as Windows. Like the earlier ones, not an operating system, a shell that ran on DOS. In fact, you can see the icon for it right here. That would exit out to DOS. But this time we had icons. This time we had we're starting to see programs written specifically for Windows that made use of the scrolls and the pull downs and all that kind of stuff. Problem with version 3, it was buggy, right? It was groundbreaking for what it introduced to the PC, because as PC users, we were still pretty much in DOS mode at this point. But it tended to crash a lot, and it had quite a few issues. 1992, though, Microsoft released Windows 3.1. And honestly, this was the first commercial success of Windows, the Microsoft Windows. It fixed the problems with version 3.0. This one gives us many of the features we know nowadays. Not an OS, still a shell, but this is what really caught on. Microsoft also got shrewd during this era, too. They started cutting deals with PC manufacturers, companies like Gateway and early Dells and all that kind of stuff, to where they would bundle Windows with their PCs. They also released Solitaire in this game. See that little icon there for games? Under the guise of quote-unquote mouse training. But Windows 3.1 gained extreme commercial success. Now, in this early era, that we're talking 92, 93 time frame, there was no internet, right? Well, it was the ARPANET. It wasn't anything that we as regular users were using. In fact, the browser hadn't even been invented at this point. But the need for networking computers inside corporations was starting to develop. Apple did it in the early 90s. They had a protocol called AppleTalk, and you could have a bunch of machines in the same building talking to each other. Well, Microsoft quickly developed a version of Windows that did that, and it was called Windows for Workgroups. It's actually 3.11, and it was really Windows 3.1 with some networking protocols built into it. Now, it wasn't networking as we know it, right? Like TCP/IP. It used a protocol called NetBEUI, which is really a layer 2 protocol, which you'll learn about when you go through the 105 course, the Network Fundamentals course. And it was extremely limited, but it did allow for PCs to talk to each other, at least locally. Well, here we're looking at a total split, right? So we need to actually kind of examine this. Up to now, all of Windows has still not been an operating system. It hasn't been. It's been a user shell. Even Windows 3.11 ran on top of Microsoft DOS. Well, Microsoft realized by the early 90s that this DOS thing was going to hit a wall. DOS had a lot of limitations. DOS had because this is the same DOS that was developed in 81, right? It had a memory limitation. It couldn't directly access more than 640 kilobytes of RAM. Bill Gates is famously quoted or misquoted as saying that 640K is all that anyone will ever need. Well, by the early 90s, it became pretty clear that it's not, and they need to do something about it. Well, here's the thing, though. Legacy operating systems tend to stay around. We've seen that with Windows XP, right? People buy stuff and they don't want to let it go. companies write software for an OS, and you don't want to rip that support out from underneath it. You're liable to have them not write software for your new product. So it was at this point where Windows split. Right? So there were two product lines. We ended up having the traditional Windows line, which was a shell based on DOS. And then they introduced the NT line. Windows NT stood for New Technology. Well, it's been around for 23 years now, so it's not really that new, but there's marketing for you. NT was a brand new operating system. It used a totally different kernel. NT was not based on DOS. So we ended up with two product lines running in parallel to each other. The Windows DOS version was intended for home use, and NT was intended for business, and that's really where they were trying to go with this. First version of NT came out in 95 time frame, 94, 95. It was called NT 3.51, and it looked a lot like Windows 3, just like Windows 3.1, except that it had the same shell, the same GUI, but it was a different kernel, a different operating system. Those memory limitations from DOS were gone, which meant that it was not compatible with the other versions of Windows. Right? Intended for business, Microsoft released two versions of this. There was a server version and the workstation version. This is a model they stuck with, really have stuck with all the way to modern times. Again, the interface for Windows NT was the interface for Windows 3.1. Now, in our face-to-face class, we actually do a lab where we crack open a modern version of Windows, Windows 7, and compare some of the tools, the utilities that come bundled with Windows 7 with stuff that was around in 1994. And a couple of them have changed hardly any at all. Like Disk Administrator is still in Windows even today for taking care of your disk partitions. And perfmon, Performance Monitor, a utility for monitoring how your system is performing, whether it's bogged down or not. You're going through and earning your Microsoft certifications, you're going to be learning how to use these tools. They're not new. They've been around for well over 20 years. 1995, Windows introduced Windows 95. And I remember the hype on this. I remember when this got released, there were people camping out in front of Best Buy waiting to go get their copy of Windows 95 and be the first to install it. Windows 95 was groundbreaking. And well, let's talk about what it is. For one, it's not an operating system. Well, it is. It's still based on DOS, though. Right? For the first time, though, Windows had the GUI integrated into it. The DOS and the GUI, it's a GUI wrapper around a DOS core. But look what it gave us. It gave us really this user experience that we've been used to now all the way through Windows 7. The one that every user who's younger than 20 years old, this is all they've seen. Microsoft actually broke this model with Windows 8, and that's really the reason why Windows 8 kind of flopped. But look what 95 gave us, a start button, a little taskbar down here on the bottom that holds our active programs, the system tray here on the right-hand bottom with a clock, a My Computer icon, a recycle bin. At the same time, Microsoft released Windows NT 4. Like the earlier version of NT, it had the same GUI as Windows 95. In this case, though, this one is not based on DOS. It is a totally separate operating system. So we can trace our lineage. We can see here we've got Windows 95. And I got NT 4.0. And down the two family lines go. Two parallel products, totally incompatible with each other. Over the next few years, Microsoft released updates to Windows 95. That's really the best way you could describe these. Windows 98 was actually a pretty marked improvement over 95, and a later version of 98 called Windows 98 SE Special Edition was actually a very stable OS and was in use for a lot of years. In 1999, trying to cash in on the new millennium, Microsoft introduced Windows ME, the Millennium Edition. This was just Windows 98 with fresh window dressing on it. It was just gift wrapped. ME was one of Microsoft's great flops. This was rushed out the door and trying to catch the hype of the year 2000, and it didn't work very well. It crashed. I had two systems with ME on it. Ironically, one worked great, and another system was a laptop, crashed all the time. Windows ME had some real issues going on with it. ME was also the last of the DOS-based OSs. Right, so we follow our line down here. We got Windows 98, ME. Well, where did they go with the NT line? Windows 2000. In the same year, in '99, Microsoft released the next version of Windows NT, and they called it Windows 2000. Again, trying to cash in on the Millennium thing. This is a direct descendant of Windows NT, so it does not use the DOS kernel. It's its own it's its own entity, and it had the same GUI as Windows ME. Right. This also introduced a lot of elements that we use today. This introduced the concept of Active Directory, which is the Microsoft Directory Service. It's the ones that still use today. If you're running Windows Server 2012 R2, you're running a system that's a direct descendant of this operating system right here. Well, on the next version over, Microsoft brought their two product lines together. And I'm sure we've all seen this, Windows XP. And this is where the two lines join. At this point, Microsoft did away with the DOS-based operating systems. Everybody went to the NT kernel for home use and business use, and it became known as Windows XP. It's still out there. I mean, it hasn't been supported now for a few years, but as of this recording, it still makes up like 15% of the operating systems on the planet, right? XP is a very, very common, very highly adopted operating system. Well, sticking with the model of having a desktop OS and a server version, the server version of XP was Windows Server 2003, which you see right here. It is XP with server tools on it, Active Directory, DNS servers, DHCP servers, that kind of stuff. I'm going to skip right over Windows Vista. XP was one of the more long-lived systems, and even by 2006, it was getting a bit long in the tooth. I mean, it had been out there for 5 years already, which was unprecedented for Microsoft operating systems. Previously, they released new OSs every few years. Well, they tried to release a version to replace XP, and it was called Microsoft Vista. Problem: it was such an ambitious project and was pushed out the door. Well, not really quickly. It was in development for a few years. It wasn't done yet. It wasn't fully cooked. Got released and turned out to be a commercial flop. People dug in their heels with XP. We're not getting rid of our XP. We're keeping it. Well, a couple years later, Microsoft took Vista, fixed the problems with it, and released it as Windows 7, which you see right here. Nowadays, this is still the most common version of Windows, although later ones are starting to overtake it. If you're running Windows in Enterprise, more than likely you're doing Windows 7. As new as it is, and this came out over 20 years after Windows 95, look at our elements though. Start button in the left-hand corner, a system tray on the right-hand corner, a taskbar, recycle bin. The user experience is still unchanged, relatively. The Windows 7 Server version was called Windows Server 2008. The original Server 2008 was a server version of Vista, and it shared many of the same problems. When Windows 7 was released, Server 2008 R2, stands for Release 2, was released, came out. And this is still a very common server operating system, right? It's 8 years old as of this year, but it's still pretty highly adopted. Then in 2012, Microsoft released Windows 8, the original Windows 8. What's missing here? What do we not have? Oh, look at that. No start button in the left-hand corner. For reasons that really were never truly articulated, Microsoft changed the user experience, the one that people have had 20 years of muscle memory, and got rid of the start button. Really what they're trying to do is make a tablet-based OS. And the idea was that you're going to have the same operating system on your phone versus your tablet versus your touchscreen laptop. Well, that's great. Problem is, people hated it. The original Windows 8 was considered a total flop. Technically, it was a solid operating system. From a technical perspective, it worked great. But getting rid of that little button right there, well, that just doomed it. The server version of Windows 8 was Windows Server 2012. And again, this is Windows 8 with server tools installed on it. Notice, again, no start button down here. They kept that model. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't plan on running a server on my tablet. So that's really the reason why Server 2008 is still out there. It's still kind of common because people did not want to go to this. A couple years later, I think it was 2013, 2014 timeframe, Microsoft tried to make their users happy. They were like, fine, we'll put a start button back on. So they took Windows 8 and they released Windows 8.1. And there's our little button there. Problem, it's not really a start button. It just goes back to that Metro interface, the same one that if you hit the Windows key under Windows 8, window dressing. This did get more highly adopted, and arguably Windows 8.1 isn't bad on a system with a touchscreen, right? But many of us still have systems that don't have touchscreens. We use keyboard and mice, so there's a bit of a gap there. The server version of Windows 8.1 was 2012 R2. And notice that we got our start button back. Like on Windows 8.1, it just goes to the Metro screen. That said, Server 2012 R2 is considered the modern Windows Server. Right? If you're implementing Active Directory in business nowadays, this is the platform that you're introducing it on. It's very capable, very powerful, and becoming extremely common. A lot of these GUIs we looked at, you got to go take a look at in a lab. I'll have another video posted that talks about, we'll take a quick look at that. But there are organizations out there and hobbyists that collect these things. There's an obsolete computer museum where people collect 30-year-old computers and they display them in like a true museum. Likewise, this website right here, tositech.com, this is just a guy who's a hobbyist. He maintains a museum of graphical user interfaces. Pretty much everyone you could think of. This URL takes you right to it. It is actually pretty interesting. You're going to look at all the Linux GUIs. You're going to look at Windows through the years, how Mac changed, what the proprietary Unix has changed like, along with stuff you've never even heard of. It's pretty cool. And that wraps up our fire hose of Windows operating systems. I know it. It was a lot. But you totally need this. You don't want to be the person who arrives on site at a company and they're still running NT 4.0, and yes, that's happened to me, and not know what you're even talking about. And you're like, I think it's Windows, but it's like old. No. You need to understand what it is and how it relates to our modern operating systems. So, good stuff. Let's go ahead and jump into our labs. You have a DistroWatch lab, and check out the GUI Museum.